Have you ever been to the top of the Empire State Building? Have you ever seen the crack in the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia? Have you ever stood in the Suffolk Resolves House where the original Articles of Confederation were created? Have you ever stood and looked out at the wonder of the Grand Canyon and not felt history? Welcome back to another episode of Broker Talk. I'm Larry Lawfer, your host each week, bringing you a half hour of Behind the Velvet Rope look at real estate. There are three levels of historical commissions in the United States: federal, state, and local. Each designation for inclusion as an historical property has differing guidelines, rules, and restrictions. Today's show is about this topic. I'm joined today by Jenn Doherty, who works for the Massachusetts Historical Commission as the local government program coordinator, and Stephen O'Donnell, the chairman of the Milton Historical Commission. Thank you both for joining us here on Broker Talk to discuss historical properties and what this means for property owners. Here in Massachusetts, we have 351 towns in the state. Of those 351, only 130 towns have local historical commissions. Before we get to the why of that, I would like to ask you, Jenn, what the heck does an historical commission do and why does it matter?
Sure. So local historical commissions serve to protect and preserve the historic resources in a community. They're appointed by the town. They're an appointed board similar to a planning board or a select board, even though that is elected. But they're appointed by the select board of the city council to protect the community's historic resources. And those resources might include things like buildings, but they can also include landscapes such as cemeteries or battlefields, or even objects such as statues.
Fences.
And it's important to note that historical commissions are different than historical societies. Historical societies are private organizations, whereas historical commissions are official town boards with regulatory powers.
So there's 351 towns, and only 130 of them have historical commissions. Why the difference, and why do we need local if we already have state and federal, Steve?
Well, the local historical commission in Milton, for example, or in any town or city that has it, is concerned about only that town or city rather than the federal or the state. So they're better attuned to the local problems, the areas within a small town as opposed to the whole state.
Okay, well, I do understand that, but then why do less than half, or about half, no, less than half, my math, why do less than half of the towns have these commissions or have these districts? Because
Jenn?
I think there's a difference. I think I'm confusing us. There are,
Yep.
thank you, Jenn. I looked in your eyes and I said, nope, I said that wrong. Steve, you are the historical commission.
Correct.
And an historical commission oversees. Milton does not have local historic districts. It has federal and state historic districts. So
Yes.
Milton is now studying this to create an historic district. So back to the question, why create a district when you have federal and state?
Okay, so why should you have a local historic as opposed to a town historical commission? A local historic district committee can impose a lot more restrictions on property than the Milton Historical Commission can. The Historical Commission oversees, as Jenn suggested, historic structures, landscapes, character, but they don't have any real way to enforce preservation. A local historic district, and the language can get confusing. A local historic district committee can create its own rules and regulations about how or when a property should be or could be preserved. I think the language that's often used is the preservation of architectural elements visible from a public way. Now, the Historical Commission cannot control that, but a local historic district can. So the local historic district has a lot more power to preserve than a historical commission.
Well, I think that's one of the things that people are afraid of, Jen, aren't they? When you get phone calls from, say, for instance, real estate agents, wondering what are some of the questions that you get asked.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we certainly get calls all the time about properties in historic districts, about properties on the National Register, and about properties that even just have a sign on them. And a lot of times, folks really don't understand the difference between any kind of different designations. But a lot of the times, it's really just sort of figuring out the different layers and talking about what different designations mean. And really, even with a local historic district, it is important to note that it's not necessarily halting all development in that area of the community or on that property, but it's really just a time for a pause and, an opportunity to consider the character of the property, the overall character of the neighborhood and the district that the district is protecting. And, there is development that happens and occurs and can occur in these areas. It just really has to go through a process. There's a historic district commission that oversees the district. And so they, like Steve said, will review changes proposed in those districts.
I think it's really interesting to note that historic districts or something that's historical, some people don't even understand that. They think of, well, it's an historical building. It's a special type of architecture. That is one of them. But Suffolk Resolves, that's not particularly, I mentioned Suffolk Resolves, that is in fact in Milton, Massachusetts. I have toured that with Steve not too long ago. And that is not a significant building. Please don't yell at me yet here. But things historically happened there. I understand there are many historic stone fences that can't be moved. So, what do homeowners, what are they afraid of if something gets designated that they own and all of a sudden it becomes part of an historic district? What are some of the questions, Steve, that you expect to hear from at your commission meetings?
Well, we're frequently contacted by architects or contractors. What can we do? I see that it's in a National Register historic district. What constraints does that place upon us? The answer is none. A National Register designation is honorary. It's recognition that there is history or heritage connected with the site, but it doesn't control what the owner can do with the property. The Historic Commission would be able to temporarily delay a demolition if certain things are accomplished and so forth, but cannot forever prevent it. So in Milton, we have a 2-year demolition delay, and if that were imposed, it would prevent the demolition for 2 years, creating, as Jen suggested, wait a minute. What are the alternatives to demolition? Is there a way to update this property? Is there a way to renovate it, retaining the historical character of the building? Or could it be relocated? Save the building. You have something in the middle of a 2-acre lot and you want to divide it. Well, could you relocate the house to one of the lots and preserve it that way? It's kind of a stopgap. Wait a minute. Is there an alternative, and how can we get to an alternative to demolition?
And that is, in fact, what happened with the Suffolk Resolves houses. They were picked up and moved from where they are to where they are now.
That's correct.
One of the solutions. Let's step a little back a little bit and talk about the federal level, Jen, and maybe you can help because you're closer to it. But there are two designations for the federal level, and one of them, for instance, the well, the White House, for one, that's protected. That property is protected. I imagine the Liberty Bell, which I mentioned, I think that's federally protected. And so that means that in one situation, they get funds to continue to operate. And that's one level. What level is that for the federal group?
So those would be properties that are owned by the federal government. National parks, things like Liberty Bell, other national properties, properties that are owned by the federal government. Those are owned and maintained by them. That's those larger, especially significant buildings that you think of are owned by them. That money comes from the federal budget to maintain those properties.
Right, and then there are others that are just we think you're important, but you don't get any federal funds for it, and we have six of those. We meaning we in Milton. I don't know if the audience knows. I actually physically live in Milton. I am the chairman of the study committee, and I'm so excited to have you both on because. For the towns that I have talked to about this, there is a mix between protecting heritage and understanding that development and growth is necessary. The people who were here in the 1700s didn't have any idea that we'd have the growth that we have here, weren't thinking about that. But now we have to think about that to protect the growth. Do you think that the select board in Milton designating a committee to study this is going to come out with, what do you think they're going to come out with, Stephen?
I think that the select board will tend to approve what you recommend. And again, if you're going to create a local historic district, you're going to define the parameters, or you're going to define the perimeter of the district. And presumably in order to do that, you will be having conversations with the people within that perimeter, explaining the benefits, answering questions about their objections, and make a recommendation that this local historic district be approved. And it's my understanding that it isn't the select board that will approve it, but town meeting has to approve it. So
Right.
You're approaching a much wider group than just the select board.
Right.
And you make the determination, the size of the district. It could be 6 buildings, it could be 12 buildings, it could be a single building. I understand the city of Somerville has 100 or more single building local historic districts. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you're doing in your committee.
Well, the district in that case is really not a district; it's a building. And
Correct.
here, the federal government has chosen 6 areas that are considered historic areas to them, and they are in fact historic areas. But are they still relevant? Is their history still important? So it's a cool building. Somebody cool lived there. Something great happened there, or it's significant because of an event that happened there. We have the railway district in Milton, and that's how all the granite from Quincy got to build the Charlestown pyramid. What's the name of that Charlestown pyramid?
Bunker Hill.
Bunker Hill. Sorry, my history. I know the building. I didn't. So that is significant in our history. Are those buildings need to be protected because of that? This is what the public is asking us.
Some of those buildings may. A local historic district might not include the entire Railway Village historic area. but perhaps one street or one corner of the neighborhood. So it's not necessarily duplicating, it may
Right.
be accentuating some of the buildings, but not necessarily duplicating the whole district.
Jen, as you oversee other towns and all the people that you talk to across the state, um, what kinds of issues do they face that you have resources that you can help with, other
Yeah.
than incredible resource that you are? Thank you.
Yeah, so I work with all 351 cities and towns, and I help them with their demolition delay bylaws, like Steve mentioned, that pause period. I help them with their local historic district commissions. We have several communities around the state right now that are working their way as well, like Milton, through establishing historic districts. And then just answering sort of general questions. We have a monument. Who does it belong to? Our town is looking to do work on a barn that the town owns. What should we do? How should we think about that project? And so just sort of generally supporting their historic preservation activities within the community. Because it is not just, telling people what you can and can't do with their property. It's, really showing a community that they have these historic resources that are important and that relate to the community's history and its development. And that's really what these historical commissions are charged with, outside of the separate historic district commissions.
Well, this is not a political show, but some of these things are political in nature. For instance, the taking down of statues, and that was national. That slave owners, there was a rise up to take those, or Confederate soldiers. Here in Massachusetts, we have Faneuil Hall. It's famous. It's a wonderful, wonderful market. It turns out Faneuil himself owned slaves, and slave trading was actually done in this building at one point. So there's discussion about taking that name off there. I'm not sure if whitewashing our history is such a good idea. And I guess that's my political bias. Steve, what do you think about things like that?
I don't think you can erase history. History is what it is. And some parts of it we don't like, but it's still history. And I think it perhaps needs to be handled differently than the way it's been handled in the past. But I don't think anybody's going to come around and suggest demolishing Faneuil Hall because of what went on 300 years ago. But I think people need to be aware of what went on. And again, we may not like it, but it is history. We can't erase it.
Right. Well, let me choose Yawkey Way. The Yankees owned the Boston Red Sox for years. Well known that he was a racist and never wanted any black players on our teams for a long time. They wanted to change the name of the Yawkey Way, and I believe they did. I think it's called Red Sox Way now.
Now, I believe it's gone back to Lansdowne Street, which is what it was originally. And I think the Red Sox petitioned the city to change the name, and the city indeed did change it.
Well, Yawkey was the owner, and now we have a different owner, and
Yes.
it is adjusting history in some ways, but I think it has to be a balance between preserving what we know as our community. Without the Blue Hills, Milton would be less of a town, and so how do we control that without controlling all of the development? And the way Milton has done it is a little bit different than the way Newton did it. Newton just banned all teardowns for a period of time. I think you're slowly getting back into allowing certain types of buildings to be put up. But there was fear in the town a couple of years ago about losing the character of all of these wonderful buildings. I don't know. I grew up in a historic area in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, right near where Washington crossed the Delaware, Doylestown, Bucks County, and I love the old houses. You know, I think there is a sense about them, and houses are houses, but homes are where history happened, whether it's your family history or other history. And I really appreciate that, and I think most people do, unless they think of it just as a transaction.
To build off what you just said about Newton, for example, I think one of the reactions that happened in Newton was because of what was happening in Wellesley and Weston. And now, after many years of teardowns, the people in those towns are realizing that the character of their town has changed. Um, I've had people complain about some of the post-war developments, the Levittown type developments, capes and ranches, small houses on relatively small lots for returning veterans and so forth. Well, you go in and you start taking 2 or 3 houses on every street, demolishing them and building something much larger. You're changing the character of the neighborhood. Now, you may or may not think the character is historic, but it is changing the character of the neighborhood and the character of the town.
Right. Right. Jen, do you see that in other areas of the state than the ones we're just mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, really throughout Eastern Massachusetts and even to some degree, out in the western part of the state, it's an issue. Development is an issue. And, the communities are starting to realize this and starting to look for ways to preserve all different kinds of buildings and housing in their communities. It's especially important too, because, a lot of that post-war housing that Steve mentioned, it's smaller. It can be sort of that, starter home or that sort of what we call missing middle housing, where it's not an apartment or a small condo, and it's not, a big multi-million-dollar house. It's something that's going to be affordable for someone, for a family just starting out. It provides a variety of housing in a community, in addition to, being a piece of the community's history.
Right.
We today may not think of those, sort of immediate post-war years as historic, but they have had such a great impact on the landscape of especially Eastern Massachusetts,
Right.
that 50 years from now it could be considered historic. So it's important to protect it while we can, protect it for the future, and not even just for historic reasons, but because it can serve as a good source of housing today.
The Levittown that you bring up, Steve, is in fact in Bucks County, and my parents lived there right before I was born. My father came back from the war, and these were tiny little bungalows, and my parents had lifelong friends, although none of them lived there for very long because they were back then starter homes, and
Right.
starter homes were like $20,000, not like starter homes right now, which can be in our area 400,000. So but they were significant and they were important, and I don't know if they're still there. Bucks County has gone through such, I haven't lived there either for a long time, but who was it that built that? They're now building luxury homes, the people who built Levittown.
Well, Bill Levitt was the person who founded the company, and I
Right.
suspect somebody else acquired it along the way.
Right.
Well, it's very difficult to build an inexpensive house today.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And as Jen said, these houses are today's starter homes,
Yeah.
but they're not 10 or 20,000. They may be 4 or 500,000. But what happens is somebody comes in, buys it, knocks it down, and builds one for $1 million too.
Yeah.
So the person who might have been interested in that starter home doesn't have the opportunity.
Let's assure the audience, especially the consumers listening to this, what the Historical Commission and the Historic District can't do. They can't dictate a whole lot to you. Jen, do you want to start with that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that the historic district only comes into play if you are actually going to make a change to your property. So they cannot compel a property owner to do anything. They can't make your house look more historic or anything like that. It's only if you're actually planning to do work and you're actually planning to change something. If you're replacing like with like, the historic district commission has no review. And then as Steve said, it's only the external portions of the property, exterior of the property, and things that are visible from a public way. So a lot of times the back of the house is not visible. You could build a whole wall of windows back there, and the Historic District Commission probably wouldn't be able to see it and wouldn't have any say over that. And inside the house, again, you can certainly do whatever you want within the limits of local building code, I suppose.
Well, part of that, from the building point of view, if you have stone building, it's a little harder to run your plumbing and your electric, and so it does have issues. The other question I had someone ask me 2 days ago is if I have leaded glass in my house, that is not very efficient, energy efficient. Can I take them out? And I said, I'm not sure about that. Let's go ask. It wasn't in my town, so and we're in the process of getting that answered. Leaded glass is most of Beacon Hill has leaded glass. You know, it's I don't know if it's better or worse, but it was pretty cool. And I was asked how you know leaded glass. A lot of people don't know that glass is actually liquid. It doesn't move very much, but it's liquid. And so if you look at a window and you wonder if it's leaded glass, if the bottom part of that is thicker than the top part, you probably have leaded glass, at this point.
Yep.
But the other things that people are afraid of is their values, the valuation of their home. If I'm in a historic home, I can't sell it, or I'm going to lose money because people won't be able to do what they want to do. That's a misnomer as well. I think you were talking earlier today, Jenn, about a Connecticut study that found out during the last recession that historic homes saved value, retained value than the other homes. I have an idea of why that is. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think for one, people value these houses more.
Yeah.
There is more interest in them. But beyond that, the Historic District Commission and having a local historic district, it does provide protection not only for your house, but for your neighbors' houses as well.
Yeah.
So you have a level of assurance that your neighborhood is not going to drastically change. The
Right.
character of your neighborhood is not going to drastically change. There's not going to be suddenly a 5-story apartment building across the street from your single family house. So it's a way of sort of preserving the character, but that also then preserves the value of these properties by making assurances about what can happen there.
In the historical homes I've been in, and I've been all over the country, and I love homes like that. So if there's a tour, I'll take a tour. What I find is that they're built better. Quite often, they were important because important people live there, and the level of craftsmanship is different than in the 70s when they were just slapping stuff up. 1970s. Not 18 or 1770s. It's kind of amazing that we have to talk about that. But I was talking to an agent on another show that I do, and she is from north of Spain, and she has a convent for sale. And this convent, it's a fantastic. It's also a vineyard, and only 4 million. And I say that like only 4 million, but 4 million in some areas in Boston's harbor doesn't get you a condominium. But here you get this whole thing. And she said it was built in the 1300s. That's 1200, but it was rehabbed recently. It was rehabbed in the 1800s, the 18th century. And I said, that's before we built anything here. So, that's old. That's not, we don't call that rehabbed.
True.
Yep, it's true.
This is a completely fascinating topic, and I wanted to come out and bring you both on so we can help consumers understand that this whole designation of historical properties, historic districts, and historic commissions are here to protect our communities, and they do for them. And if you bought a small house and want to put a big house on there, you should understand that it may take you a little bit longer than you thought, based on what. Talk to your agent. Your agent should know what's going on in the town. If they don't, get a better agent. Is there any last words that you'd like to share with us, Jenn?
No, I guess, like Steve, or like you just said, Larry, there are a lot of layers to it. And just because it is a historic house doesn't mean, oh, we can't touch it. Oh, we can't ever do anything to it. So yes, certainly check in with the local planning department, the local building department, or us at the MHC, the state. All those folks can, certainly tell you what you can and can't do with the property. And also just, keep in mind that it is historic, and, consider that when you're thinking about what you're looking to do with your property. While you may not like it, you may only be, one of a long line of property owners. So you want to sort of act with care when you're considering what to do with the property.
Steve, you were probably involved in this at that time, but we have a property here in Milton that the former president, George H.W. Bush, lived in, and they wanted to mark it as historic because the president grew up, right here in Milton before they moved to Texas or Connecticut or wherever they went to. At the time that the commission wanted to put the plaque down, it was owned by a family of the other party, and they were adamant that that plaque couldn't be put on the house. And what happened was they put a great big stone and a plaque at the edge of the property. Were you involved in that at all? I just thought that was hilarious.
No, we were not involved, but they put that monument, that marker, on town property at the corner. And in fact, it's much more visible than a sign on the house would have been.
It's funny. That house now is in a little bit of disrepair, but
Yes.
it's a big old wood house.
Yeah.
But when you buy a property, you buy maintenance.
You do, but to a lot of people, or for a lot of people, it's well worth it.
Yeah.
When you buy an old house,
Yeah.
you know there's going to be maintenance. And
Yeah.
I live in one and I love it every day. It's well worth it to me.
Yeah. Well, down through history, the mark of wealth was always property. That's why kings, they would, deed property to people, because the more you had, the better it was. And as I say, they're not making anymore. But thank you so much for being part of this show. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Tune in next week for another episode of Broker Talk. Thanks for listening.